Yeah, I'm Larry Tribe. I guess my official name is Laurence H. Tribe, and I'm the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard Law School and Professor of Constitutional Law. Well, I could go on for hours, but I'll try not to. I was born in Shanghai, China in October of 1941. My parents were Jewish refugees. They came originally from Belarus. My mom was actually born in Harbin. My dad had become an American citizen shortly before he met my mother. And when I was born in Shanghai, the war was about to break out. It was October 41. Pearl Harbor occurred, of course, on December 7th, and all hell broke loose. The Japanese occupied the area of Shanghai where we lived in the French Quarter. My father was interned as a prisoner of war by the Japanese because we were, of course, at war with them. It wasn't the same as the internment of the Americans of Japanese descent here. He was actually an American citizen, and therefore it was not so uncustomary that he would be interned. And I was too young, obviously, to know the difference. But as I grew up in Shanghai, I began to sense that he had done nothing wrong. It was just his identity. He was just an American. I kept wondering, why is he being taken away? That, I think, affected my sense of injustice and the importance of being able to correct it. When the Americans liberated Shanghai, the apartment next to ours was bombed to smithereens. I survived. My family survived. But I've always known that I was amazingly lucky. I mean, I was lucky to have survived. I was lucky that my parents were able to come to the United States when I was about 5.5. We moved to San Francisco. I grew up there. I went to public schools there. I was kind of a geeky, wonky kid, not the most popular on the block, partly because I spoke only Russian rather than English, and I didn't want to speak at all because I was embarrassed. So for a while I was the silent kid, which was not typical of me. When I was in, I think it was in kindergarten in Shanghai, my brother eventually sort of dug up the report card, which said that the one problem with Tribe is that he doesn't keep his mouth shut, talks to everybody, he's unruly, he doesn't take instructions, and his fine muscle coordination leaves something to be desired, as well as his musical sense. So they pretty much covered the waterfront. But actually it wasn't music, although I love music, or my fine muscle coordination that made a big difference to me as I grew up. It was mathematics and art. I mean, I loved painting until recently, not so recently, but until only a few years ago. I've done pastel boulderscapes, landscapes, seascapes, portraits, that kind of thing. And I'm very much a right hemisphere kind of person. My brain operates more diagrammatically than in a linear way, so that when I teach constitutional law, I'm always drawing colorful diagrams on the board. My hands are covered with red and pink and green and blue dusty chalk, and the kids tend to call them tribograms, and they take pictures of them with their iPhones, and I'm always amused that they find them so illuminating. At first, some kids are, especially Harvard Law students, are more linear, but I digress. So I grew up in San Francisco. I went to public schools. I was doing some advanced math work sort of by a correspondence course at UC Berkeley, so that I knew quite a bit of math when I went to Harvard College when I was quite young. I was 16. Probably a mistake. It was hard to get dates. I was really a kid, whereas these Radcliffe women, as they thought of themselves, were much too mature for me. And so I was always sort of a year ahead in one way and a year behind in another. I did well at Harvard. I ended up with a summa in mathematics, and I did some comparative literature, and I took one course in neurobiology that convinced me that I was never going to be a doctor. I had always told people when I was growing up, when I was a little kid, that I wanted to be a neurosurgeon, but when it turned out I couldn't make a Bunsen burner turn off properly, I realized that my future as a skilled lab technician was limited. I did do some graduate work in math. I took mostly graduate courses in math when I was at Harvard College because I had done lots of work in advance, and I took algebraic topology and algebraic number theory and algebraic geometry, all sorts of abstract stuff, as long as it didn't have any arithmetic in it. I was always bad at things like long division, multiplication. Addition I could handle, but subtraction was a challenge. I kid only slightly. I mean, my one not so good grade in elementary and secondary school was a grade that I will not even report here in I think it was 8th grade arithmetic. Anyway, so I went to Harvard. I graduated. I went actually into the Graduate School of Mathematics for a year on an NSF fellowship. It's a National Science Foundation fellowship. And I realized that when I was taking nothing but math and was not sort of leavening the loaf, or whatever the right image is, with a dose of humanities and literature or anything else, I was going to go out of my head. I mean, I also wasn't a genius at it. I was good. Obviously, you have to be pretty good to get a summa. But I wasn't a genius. And I thought that mathematics was a field where if you were not a genius, you were just not going to make a contribution to the world. And this will sound corny, but I felt lucky enough to have survived, to have gotten to America, where, I was really a corny kid. I believed in all of the freedoms that we have, and sort of the beliefs that I had then are very similar to those I have now about the fundamental importance of human rights. And I felt very fortunate to be in a country where I could experience them and where there wasn't a risk that we were going to be taken over by another country and then liberated by somebody else in a way that involved devastation. And so I thought that I ought to give back something. And what I could do, I concluded, in a way that was going to make a contribution, whether I was a genius or not, was law. I could do law, and that's an area where you have to be smart to understand it deeply. You have to have some creativity to be good at it. But even if you're not the brightest bulb in your generation, you can make a real impact. You can help people lead more fulfilling lives. And I was always interested, ever since I went to Harvard Law School, in that. I made a very quick switch from mathematics to law, so quick that I missed the application deadline at Harvard Law School. And I was feeling very bad that I'd have to go back and finish up my PhD dissertation. And I went to see I think the assistant dean in charge of admissions or something like that. And I said, is there anything I can do to increase my chances of getting in off the waiting list? Because that's where I landed, because I had applied too late. And he said, yes, there's actually one thing you could do. You could shoot everyone ahead of the line on the waiting list. And I said, that's very good advice. And will you be my lawyer? Anyway, just before law school semester began, in the fall of 1963, I got one of those old-fashioned telegrams. Most people who are listening to this probably won't know what that looks like, but it's this yellow piece of paper with funny-looking sticky stuff on it. And it said I was admitted to Harvard Law School off the wait list. So I was ecstatic. I went to Harvard Law School. And from the beginning, I loved the law. I didn't always go to my classes, I have to admit. I've never been one for always following rules. But I loved it. I loved the cases. I loved the combination of human stories and abstract principles. I loved the way the abstract principles were not absolutely determinate. They didn't always point to one answer. I found that a little frustrating at first, because as a mathematician, where I was used to precise proofs where you could put QED at the end of the page, it was not like that in law. And it took me maybe a couple of years to figure that out. And as a result, I didn't make law review my first year of law school. And back in the day, if you didn't make law review, your career looked like it was over. Today, there are a lot of ways kids can excel in law school. But back then, I really was devastated. I had just missed law review, and I didn't know what I would do with myself, because I really wanted to get a job where I could make a difference. But long story short, I did better the second year, better still the third year, impressed some of my professors like Louis Jaffe and Archibald Cox and Paul Freund and Milton Katz. They became great mentors. One of them in particular, a lovely man named Louis Jaffe, who was probably the great intellectual giant of administrative law, knew a wonderful judge in California, Matthew Tobriner, who became a kind of hero of mine for the kind of judge he was and the kind of legal career he had led in representing the employee side of labor cases. He selected me as a law clerk for the Supreme Court of California. I clerked there for a year. I loved it. He loved me. I got an interview with Justice Potter Stewart. I managed to get that clerkship. I got the great news that I had that clerkship almost the same day that my son Mark was born. It was one hell of a red letter day. And then I clerked for Potter Stewart. I spent time after that doing some work at the National Academy of Sciences as the director of something called the Technology Assessment Panel of the Committee on Science and Public Policy. It's sort of a mouthful, but it was just looking at the secondary effects, ecological, environmental, social, cultural, of technological change. I figured that even though I had had offers at that point to teach as an assistant professor at both Harvard and Yale, I was so fresh out of law school and I was just in my late 20s, I wanted to know something that the kids didn't know so that there would be, I wanted to be close to them, and I always have. I fool myself into thinking that I'm not really old, but you can see that I am. But the fact is that I wanted to have something to impart beyond just further reflections on the things they had learned in law school, and I thought spending some time on the interface of law, technology, public policy would give me that, and it did. When I started teaching at Harvard, which I ended up choosing over Yale, I taught a course in law and technology for a while. I taught evidence for a while because that combined some of my interests in philosophy, epistemology, mathematics, but I actually knew nothing about trying cases, and I felt I was cheating kids when I tried to teach them about the rules of evidence, because I would do it in a very abstract way that didn't really come to grips with the reality of what it was like to actually cross-examine a witness or prepare a witness for trial or take a deposition. And so after a few years, I dropped evidence, and I ended up where I have been ever since, teaching constitutional law, which absolutely brings me to life. I mean, it is the subject. People ask, why did you pick constitutional law? Come on. I mean, who, with a real opportunity to dig into a subject of law, would not want that to be constitutional law? It has everything. It has history. It has moral philosophy, the meaning of liberty, of equality, of dignity. It has legal technicality galore. It has precedent. It involves strategy, dealing with complicated human situations of the people who are affected by laws, and the human dynamic of complicated institutions like the U.S. Supreme Court. So I've loved teaching constitutional law and have taught it at Harvard for about 45 years. Speaking of President Obama, he is one of the students that I got to know when I was teaching. One of the great privileges of teaching constitutional law at Harvard and teaching a popular class that a lot of kids sign up for, more than can get into it, is that you end up with some very, very bright students. I taught John Roberts, the Chief Justice. I taught Barack Obama, who also became my research assistant for a couple of years, did wonderful, wonderful, brilliant work. I taught Elena Kagan, who was also my research assistant, Kathleen Sullivan. I mean, if I started to name them, the people that I didn't name would be rightly offended because they're all so impressive. And lots of my friends all over the country now, some of them you wouldn't recognize their names, but they're terrific people, and I've gotten to know them and I stay in touch with them after they leave the law school. Teaching law was what I wanted to do at that point. I hadn't planned to practice, although before I had the great good fortune of getting offers to teach from Harvard and Yale, I assumed I would practice at a law firm and combine ordinary practice with public interest work. But it turned out that I was able to teach, and I didn't do any of the practice. As I explained, I'd never done any trial work, so evidence didn't make sense. But at one point, after I realized that there hadn't been an adequate overall comprehensive summary of American constitutional law for something like a century, and that I'd better try to write one, which I would never have done again if I had realized what an unbelievably impossible task it was. I mean, I worked morning, noon, and night, day in, day out, every day, producing this tome, which has had a real impact. In any event, had I not done that, I don't think I ever would have gotten into practice, because that was cited by various people, and so people just assumed that I had experience in the Supreme Court, and I was asked to do a case in 1980, and it was an interesting and important case. I did it, and then I began a career as a law professor and a Supreme Court advocate at the same time. And I've had a lot of very interesting cases over the years, about 35 in the Supreme Court. And the combination of those cases, lots of pro bono activity on the side, occasional testimony before Congress, maybe 100 or so times in the House and Senate, a lot of advising for various public officials. It's been a very fulfilling career, combination of academics, public service, and sort of writing, teaching, litigating. There was only one gap as far as I was concerned, and that was I had never literally taken an oath to serve the United States government. I had taken an oath as a citizen because I was not a natural-born citizen. I was born in Shanghai. My father was an American citizen. My mother wasn't at the time. That meant I was not a citizen. I had to become one when I was about 10. But I had never, raised my right hand and said that I will serve the United States. And somehow I felt that was missing, and I wanted to do it. And because I knew the president, since he had been my research assistant, and I knew and admired the Attorney General, I hoped when the president was elected that he would have something interesting for me to do. And he did. He asked me to become the first senior counselor for access to justice, which was a made-up position. It had no budget. I had very little staff. It was a little bit frustrating that way, because you learn very quickly after you're in Washington that everything is about budget, staff, power, turf. So every time I got a good idea, somebody would look at me and say, well, it's a great idea, but this person over in the civil division wants to claim that as her bailiwick, and this is a good idea, but that's really the Civil Rights Division, or that belongs to the Solicitor General's office, or that belongs to the White House Counsel. So what I ended up doing was sparking lots of projects that involved collaboration with other parts of the government, some with Health and Human Services, some with the Labor Department, some with the White House Domestic Policy Council, some with outside groups, all of them involved with the fundamental unsolved problem of American justice, and that is its extraordinary inaccessibility. I mean, not only to the very poor, who basically can't afford lawyers, and without lawyers there's very little they can often do, but to the middle class. I mean, justice is largely unavailable, and by justice I mean real, effective delivery of the things that you're entitled to. It's all very nice to have rights on paper, but making rights real, which actually is the name of the last chapter of the most recent book that I've written with a former student and research assistant of mine, Joshua Matz, making rights real entails actually having access either to courts and lawyers or to alternative forms of dispute resolution that are not stacked against you as the little guy confronting some behemoth corporate interest. So that was an interesting time. I think I got a number of things going that I'm pleased to learn are still going on. I was at the American Constitutional Society's convention today, and I met a few interns from Texas and Massachusetts and other states, and they're interns in, guess what, the Access to Justice office that I started a few years ago with no budget. It's still limping along, and it has made some useful, if marginal, progress. But at least there is an office in the Department of Justice that is called Access to Justice. I mean, one of my surprises when I worked for the government was that when people came to visit me, and they were chief justices of many states and state attorneys general and heads of public interest firms, they would want to have their picture taken, but not so much with me, with the sign above the door in my office which said Access to Justice. It was a remarkable thing that until that point there really was no central focus in the U.S. government and in the Department of Justice for that fundamental right, the right of access to justice. And now that it's there, although its jurisdiction to some extent overlaps that of the Civil Rights Division and the Civil Division, it's, I think, going to make a lasting impact.